My name is Verath Sul, and I am the last living officer of the 7th Annihilation Fleet of the Keth Dominion. I write this not as a confession. I write this because someone must. Because if I do not put these words down, the greatest military catastrophe in the 800-year history of our empire will be remembered only as a number in a ledger: 4,000 ships, 0 survivors, no wreckage recovered. That number tells you nothing. It does not tell you what it felt like to watch certainty collapse in real time. It does not tell you what a species looks like when it has been waiting for you. I was 61 years old when I boarded the Eternal Decree. I had spent 4 decades as a war scribe, the official recorder of the Keth Dominion's military campaigns. My job was to document victories. I was very good at it because there had never been anything else to document. The 7th Annihilation Fleet was not assembled in response to a threat. It was assembled as a statement. 4,000 warships, each one longer than many of the rivers on the worlds we had claimed. The fleet stretched so far across the staging point that the last ship in formation was invisible even to our long-range sensors, a fact our high executor, a broad-shouldered commander named Dorath Kale, announced to the assembled officers with unmistakable pride. The target was a planet called Earth, third body orbiting a medium-sized yellow star in a quiet spiral arm of the galaxy that most Keth cartographers had not bothered to name with any importance. Our scouts had visited the system twice in the past 2 decades. Both times they returned with the same report: a single inhabited world, one intelligent species, biological, warm-blooded, breathes oxygen, technologically primitive by every standard we applied. They had achieved basic space travel. They had rudimentary orbital stations. Their weapons were chemical propellant-based, their energy systems barely post-nuclear, and they had no shields, no gravity weapons, and no faster-than-light capability whatsoever. There was a second report, filed by a junior scout named Orithvan 6 months before the fleet departed. I remember reading it in my quarters and setting it aside without much thought. Orithvan noted several anomalies: dense, complex electromagnetic activity on the planet's surface and in low orbit, far more than expected for a species at this technological level. Unusual thermal signatures deep underground, consistent with large-scale industrial operations. Debris fields in the outer system that did not match natural formation patterns. And a strange absence of any military satellite activity, which Orithvan suggested might mean the species had moved those systems somewhere less visible. Dorath Kale reviewed the report and dismissed it in 4 sentences. The electromagnetic activity was likely communications infrastructure. The thermal signatures were probably manufacturing of consumer goods. The outer system debris was natural, and the absence of visible military satellites simply confirmed what we already knew, that this species had not yet developed serious orbital defense capabilities. I agreed with him. We all did. It seemed obvious. 4,000 ships. We had never sent more than 200 to subdue any world, and those campaigns had ended in hours. The decision to send 4,000 was not tactical. It was political. The Dominion had been watching several independent civilizations grow increasingly vocal about our expansion. Sending 4,000 ships to a primitive world was not about the primitive world. It was about every other species watching the footage later. It was a reminder of what we were and what we could do. I sat at my documentation station aboard the Eternal Decree and recorded everything with professional calm. The fleet's departure from the staging point, the synchronized jump to faster-than-light travel, the 12-hour transit. I documented the officers' conversations, the crew's morale, the technical readiness reports. I noted that the mood aboard the flagship was almost festive. Several senior officers had brought personal recording devices to capture their own footage for family archives. A campaign against a species without faster-than-light travel was, in their estimation, about as dangerous as a formal inspection. Dorath Kale gave a brief address to the fleet through the ship-wide channel just before we dropped out of faster-than-light. His voice was steady and practiced. He spoke about the Dominion's long history, about the order and stability we brought to every world we claimed. He spoke about the species below us, their small wars and their fragmented civilizations and their primitive technology, and he said that today we would offer them the same choice we offered every world: submission and survival, or resistance and consequence. He did not mention that the choice was not really a choice. In 800 years of expansion, no species had ever chosen resistance and survived. The option existed only as a courtesy. I finished my documentation log entry for the transit and began a new one for what I expected would be a very short campaign. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in near-perfect formation, 30,000 kilometers above the planet called Earth. The planet below us was blue and green and white with clouds, wrapped in a thin, bright atmosphere. It was, genuinely, one of the most visually striking worlds I had ever seen in 4 decades of recording campaigns. I noted this in my log. A beautiful world, small but vivid. I felt a faint trace of what I can only describe as aesthetic regret, not ethical regret, not yet. Just the mild passing thought that it was a shame something so visually appealing would look considerably different after our preliminary bombardment. The first thing I registered was the silence. Every campaign I had ever documented began the same way, with noise, distress signals, emergency military transmissions, panicked communications between defense stations, civilian broadcasts dissolving into chaos. Every species, no matter how primitive, generated a surge of desperate electromagnetic noise when 4,000 warships materialized above their world. It was as reliable as gravity. Earth was silent. Not the silence of a dead world. Our sensors confirmed the planet was alive with activity, billions of life signs, massive energy consumption, enormous amounts of electromagnetic traffic. They simply were not broadcasting anything outward. No distress calls, no military alerts, no emergency frequencies lighting up. The planet's entire communications infrastructure had gone dark on external channels, as if someone had thrown a single switch and cut the noise. I stared at my monitoring screen and felt the first small, cold thread of something I did not yet recognize as fear. Doreth Kale noticed the silence too. I watched him from my station across the bridge. He stood at the main viewport for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the quiet planet. Then he turned to his communications officer and asked for a standard colonial declaration broadcast, the formal message we sent to every target world, announcing our presence and delivering the terms of submission. The message went out. It traveled at the speed of light, painting every frequency band we could reach. There was a pause of perhaps 40 seconds. Then a single transmission came back. The voice was human, unmistakably biological, calm and unhurried, speaking in a language our translation systems identified and converted in near real time. The voice identified itself only as the Planetary Defense Coordinator. It acknowledged our transmission. It informed us that we had entered restricted space under the jurisdiction of Earth's Unified Defense Authority. It instructed us to halt our fleet at current position and not advance further. It told us that any further movement toward the planet would be interpreted as a hostile act. There was a long pause on the bridge, and then Doreth Kale started laughing. It was not cruel laughter. It was genuinely amused laughter, the laughter of a man who has heard something so far outside normal experience that his brain converts it to comedy. The other officers joined him. I heard it ripple through the bridge crew like a wave. Even I smiled, though I noticed, even then, even in that moment, that my smile was a fraction slower than everyone else's. One voice, one transmission, no fleet, no weapons platforms lighting up, no emergency mobilization. Just a calm human voice telling 4,000 warships to stop. Doreth Kale composed himself and gave the order without drama. Target the largest landmass. Preliminary bombardment. Standard pattern. Begin. The weapons systems aboard the Eternal Decree, powered up with a sound I had heard 100 times, a deep, resonant charge that you felt in your bones more than you heard with your ears. Around us, across the formation, 300 other ships in the forward line were preparing the same. I opened a fresh documentation log. I began typing the date and time of the campaign's opening action. I remember the exact words I was writing: first engagement commencing at, when the sensor arrays across the entire bridge began screaming at once. I stopped typing. Every proximity alert, every long-range scanner, every passive detection system on the Eternal Decree activated simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming, a layered, overlapping shriek of warnings stacking on top of each other faster than any operator could process. On the main tactical display, which I could see clearly from my station, something was happening below us on the planet's surface and in the space between us and it. Things were rising. Not one thing, not 10 things, not 100. Thousands of objects launching from sites across the entire surface of the planet, emerging from locations our initial scans had registered as empty terrain or civilian infrastructure. They were moving at speeds that made the tactical display struggle to render their trajectories. The tracking system kept updating, and every update showed them moving faster than the previous reading. I remember one of the sensor operators saying, in a voice completely stripped of its professional composure, that the readings had to be a malfunction. The tactical officer said the readings were confirmed on 4 independent systems. I looked at the formation map on my secondary screen, the map that showed all 4,000 ships of the 7th Annihilation Fleet as small green icons arranged in their precise, orderly pattern. Doreth Kale gave the order to open fire. The first volley from 300 ships launched simultaneously. And then the front 200 icons on the formation map went dark. Not damaged, not disabled, dark, gone. In the space of perhaps 3 seconds, 200 ships of the Keth Dominion simply ceased to register on any sensor in the fleet. No explosion signatures, no debris fields, no emergency transponders. The space where they had been was empty, not even disturbed, as if they had been carefully, precisely removed from the universe. I sat at my documentation station with my fingers hovering above the input keys, and I could not move them. My job was to record victories. I had done it for 40 years. I was very good at it. I did not know in that moment what I was recording, but I understood, with a cold and absolute certainty that settled into me like ice, that it was not a victory. The human coordinator's voice came back on the channel, still calm, still unhurried, as if discussing a minor scheduling matter. That, the voice said, was your warning shot. I have replayed that sentence in my mind every day since, not because of the words, because of the tone. There was no satisfaction in it, no anger, no excitement. Just a quiet, professional statement of fact from someone doing a job they had prepared very carefully to do. I looked at the formation map. I looked at the 200 missing green icons. I looked at the planet below us, still blue and green and beautiful, with thousands of objects still rising from its surface like something that had been waiting underground for a very long time. And I finally recognized the feeling I had been carrying since the moment we arrived. It was not the silence of a prey animal that had seen the predator and frozen. It was the silence of a predator that had seen the prey arrive exactly where it wanted them. The Eternal Decree did not shake when it fired its weapons. It never had. Keth warship construction was precise and well dampened. The discharge of even its largest cannons produced nothing more than a slight vibration in the deck plating, the kind you only noticed if you were specifically paying attention. 40 years aboard various flagships had taught me to sleep through it. What happened in the 40 seconds after the formation map lost those 200 green icons was the first time I had ever felt the Eternal Decree shudder. Not from weapons fire, not from impact, from speed changes, from the ship's navigation system making rapid, unplanned adjustments in response to what the tactical array was feeding it. The ship's automatic threat response was attempting to maneuver, and it was doing so in directions and at rates that were not part of any standard evasion protocol I had ever seen documented. I stayed at my station. My job was to record, and so I recorded, even though my hands were not entirely steady. Dorethkale had not moved from the center of the bridge. His posture was rigid, controlled. I had seen him maintain that posture through artillery barrages on 3 different worlds, through equipment failures, through the sudden loss of 2 escort ships to an asteroid field on the Pelvic campaign. He was not a man who showed alarm easily, but his eyes were moving very quickly between the tactical display and the formation map, and his jaw was set in a way I had never seen before. He ordered the forward line to advance and establish firing range. Standard aggressive response, when surprised, close the distance, overwhelm with volume. Against every other species we had encountered, volume solved problems. The order went out to the forward 1,200 ships. 300 of them accelerated as directed. The other 900 received the order and began to comply. On the tactical display, their movement icons shifted forward. They made it approximately 4 seconds before the sensor arrays started screaming again. What hit them was not a single weapon system. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for understanding what Earth had built. It was not a fleet of ships firing at our fleet of ships. What hit them was a coordinated sequence of completely different threat categories, each one deployed in a specific order with a logic that I only understood much later, after many long conversations in a clean room on Earth with people who were very patient about explaining things to me. The first layer was kinetic, high-velocity projectiles, not chemically propelled, but launched by some kind of electromagnetic acceleration system of enormous power, moving fast enough that our point defense systems, which were calibrated to intercept standard projectile velocities, could not track them until they had already arrived. They did not need to penetrate our hull shielding. They struck the shielding emitters directly, the external nodes that generated the protective fields, with accuracy that implied they had been precisely mapped long before we arrived. The second layer came while our ships were adjusting to the kinetic impacts, while shield emitters were offline and systems were rerouting. This layer was energy-based, but not in any configuration matching the energy weapons in our tactical database. It did not burn through hulls. It interacted directly with power distribution systems, inducing failures in a cascading sequence that our engineers later told me they had never seen replicated by any natural phenomenon or any weapon they had studied. The third layer was the one that genuinely confused me in the moment, because I could not understand what it was doing. Small objects moving erratically, no obvious impact, no obvious energy discharge. Ships that were struck by these objects did not immediately lose function. They continued operating for between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, and then they stopped completely all at once, as if a single central command had reached inside every system and issued a shutdown order. I documented all of this in real time. My hands were shaking by the end of the second layer, but I kept writing. I kept writing because it was the only useful thing I could do, and because some part of me, the professional part, the part that had been doing this job for 40 years, understood that what I was witnessing needed to be recorded precisely and completely, even if I was not yet sure who would ever read it. The formation map was changing faster than I could comfortably process. Green icons going dark, singly and in groups, with no pattern I could identify. It was not the front line falling first, or the flanks, or the center. Ships were being taken out across the entire formation simultaneously, as if whatever Earth had deployed was not aiming at positions, but at individual ships, each one targeted separately according to some priority system I could not decode. Dorethkale ordered a concentrated salvo from the full remaining fleet at the objects rising from Earth's surface. Every available weapon, every ship, firing in the same direction at the same time. I had documented concentrated salvos before against fortified space stations. Against the one alien fleet we had ever encountered that tried to fight back. When 4,000 Keth warships fired simultaneously, the energy output was, by our own measurements, sufficient to crack a small moon. The salvo launched. The energy output was enormous. Our sensors lit up with the discharge readings. The objects from Earth's surface that were already in our formation continued operating without interruption. And the new wave that had just finished rising from the planet below us began moving. I intercepted a human communication at this point, not because I was skilled at interception, but because whoever was broadcasting it made no effort to hide it. It came in on an open frequency, and our translation system converted it automatically. It was an internal exchange between what sounded like two human engineers somewhere on the surface. One of them said that Sector 7's third wave had deployed cleanly, but the dispersal pattern was running about 4% wide of the modeled projection. The other said that 4% was within acceptable variance and that the next wave would self-correct. The first one said something about a fuel cost overrun on the second layer and whether the budget office was going to send another complaint. The second one said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it down immediately, "Let them complain. This is what we built it for." And then they moved on to discussing technical specifications that our translation system could not fully render because the terminology had no equivalence in the Keth scientific vocabulary. I sat with that exchange for a moment. I read it back. I read it a third time. They were talking about budget overruns. They were talking about dispersal variance. They were talking about this, about the systematic removal of 4,000 warships as a project management discussion. Dorathkale ordered FTL jump preparation. Emergency withdrawal. I have to say this clearly, Dorathkale was not a coward. He was tactically sound, and what he was doing was tactically correct. There was no military logic in staying. Whatever Earth had built, we could not match it with our remaining forces, and preserving even a fraction of the fleet was better than losing everything. The FTL drives began charging across the fleet. I felt the familiar low hum that preceded a jump, a sound every Keth spacefarer knew, the sound of escape and transit and the vast distances between stars. The hum built and built, and then it stopped. Every FTL drive in the entire fleet attempted to complete its charge cycle and found something blocking it. Not a mechanical failure, all systems showed green, but the jump was not executing. The space around us was responding incorrectly to the drive's output. The jump field would begin to form and then fold back, like trying to push open a door that had been sealed from the other side. The tactical officer reported that passive sensors were detecting gravity well anomalies at multiple points surrounding our position. Not natural anomalies, structured ones, arranged in a pattern that formed a boundary around the fleet's entire operational area. Dorathkale was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked how large the boundary was. The answer came back. The boundary extended approximately 12,000 kilometers beyond our outermost ship in every direction. We were contained but not immediately threatened. Whatever was holding the FTL drives down was not itself a weapon. I remember thinking in that moment that containment without immediate pressure was almost worse than direct attack. It was a message. It said, "We can end this whenever we choose to end it. We are not hurrying." The formation map showed 1,640 green icons remaining. We had arrived with 4,000. Dorathkale stood at the center of the bridge for a very long time, looking at the tactical display. The bridge was quiet, not the professional quiet of a disciplined crew at work, but the fragile quiet of people who had run out of options and had not yet accepted it. I kept writing. My documentation log for this campaign was already longer than any I had written before. Most campaigns were short. Most campaigns were simple. I had never had this much to record. He opened the communication channel to Earth himself. He did not have an officer do it. He spoke directly in Keth and let the translation system carry his words. He identified himself. He gave his rank and his position. He told the human coordinator that the Dominion fleet was prepared to discuss terms. He said this calmly, with the practiced neutrality of a military officer trained to treat all situations as negotiable. There was a silence of perhaps 20 seconds. And then the human coordinator responded. Not with terms, not with demands. The voice said 7 words that I wrote down immediately and have not stopped thinking about since. We read your history files. You didn't leave debris either. The channel closed. I looked at those 7 words on my documentation screen. I looked at the formation map. I looked at the quiet blue planet below us, still going about its existence with the same unhurried calm it had maintained since the moment we arrived. The human coordinator was right. I had documented dozens of campaigns. I had watched worlds fall silent. We had never left debris either. We had never left survivors to tell conflicting stories or build resistance movements or keep the memory of what they were alive. We had been, by every honest measure of the word, thorough. I sat with that knowledge for the first time as something other than a professional fact. A junior officer named Seth Raw, one of the navigation team, was sitting 2 stations to my left. He was 23 years old. He had joined the fleet 6 months ago. He had been excited to serve on the flagship for his first campaign. He was sitting very still, staring at his console, and I could see that his breathing was not quite controlled. The formation map showed 1,522 green icons now. The number had kept dropping even during the communication attempt. Whatever Earth's deployed systems were doing, they had not paused for the conversation. Dorath Kale sent a second message. He asked what terms would end the engagement. He asked what Earth required. The silence this time was longer. When the coordinator came back, the voice was different, still calm, but something in it had shifted, as if the speaker had been considering something carefully before responding. The voice said, "We don't require anything from your fleet. Your fleet is already finished. What we're deciding right now has nothing to do with you." I remember the confusion on the bridge at that statement. What we're deciding right now has nothing to do with you. It made no tactical sense. We were the fleet. We were the threat. What could they possibly be deciding that had nothing to do with us? I wrote the words down. I did not understand them yet. The formation map showed 1,489 icons. Our chief weapons officer, a veteran named Dorath who had served 30 years and had more campaign decorations than anyone else on the bridge, turned from his station and looked directly at Dorath Kale. He did not speak. He simply looked at the high executor with an expression I had never seen on a senior Keth officer's face before, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has just realized that the world operates by different rules than he thought. Dorath Kale looked back at him, then he looked at the formation map, then he looked at me. I do not know why he looked at me. I was the war scribe. I documented things. I had no tactical role. But he looked at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and I think what passed between us in that look was the shared recognition that neither of us knew what to write in our respective records for what was happening today. He turned back to the tactical display and gave the order for all remaining ships to hold position and cease weapons fire. We had been holding position and our weapons fire had been accomplishing nothing, so this was not a meaningful change to our situation. But it was the first time in 800 years of Keth military history that a fleet commander had given an order that was, in essence, an acknowledgement that there was nothing useful left to do. I opened a new section in my documentation log and began to write. I wrote that the 7th Annihilation Fleet of the Keth Dominion had engaged a target world designated as Earth, 3rd planet of a yellow star in the outer Orion Arm, and that the engagement had not proceeded as projected. I wrote that the target species had demonstrated weapons capabilities and defense systems that exceeded any intelligence assessment by several orders of magnitude. I wrote that the fleet's ability to withdraw had been neutralized by an FTL suppression field of unknown, but clearly engineered origin. I stopped typing. I looked at what I had written. I looked at the formation map, which now showed 1,401 green icons and was still moving downward. I deleted the phrase "had not proceeded as projected" and replaced it with something more accurate. I wrote, "had resulted in the near-total loss of the fleet without any meaningful damage to the target." The icons kept going dark. The planet below us kept turning, and somewhere on that beautiful blue world, two engineers were probably still arguing about budget variance reports. What I'm about to describe is not something I witnessed from a comfortable distance. I was there in the middle of it, watching it happen to the fleet around me, and I want the record to reflect that. I want future readers, Keth or otherwise, to understand that I am not reconstructing this from sensor logs reviewed in safety afterward. I saw it happen. I watched the icons disappear. I watched the crew around me process things that had no precedent in their training or experience. I was present for every minute of it, and I wrote it all down. The formation map, at the point where I resumed this account, showed 1,401 green icons. We had arrived with 4,000. The engagement had been running for approximately 47 minutes, though it felt both much longer and much shorter than that time moves strangely when you are watching certainty fall apart. Dorath Kale had ordered the fleet to hold position and cease fire. The order was largely academic. We had been firing for nearly an hour, and the tactical data showed no correlation between our weapons output and the rate at which Earth systems were neutralizing us. We had not slowed them. We had not redirected them. We had not destroyed a single one of their deployed units with any certainty. Several possible hits had been logged, but the tactical officer could not confirm any of them because the objects in question had simply moved out of the affected area before the sensor data resolved. What we had done, in an hour of sustained firing from 4,000 warships, was produce an enormous amount of heat and light in the space between ourselves and Earth. That was it. I had been trying to understand the logic of their weapon systems since the engagement began, writing notes alongside my official documentation, building a picture from fragments. What I had assembled by the 47th minute was incomplete but coherent enough to be genuinely alarming, in the specific way that understanding something makes it more alarming, not less. Earth had not built a fleet to counter a fleet. That was the key. That was the thing that every other defense we had ever encountered had failed to understand, and that Earth, somehow, had grasped completely. Building a fleet to counter a fleet means designing your weapons to defeat specific ship classes, specific shield configurations, specific armor compositions. It means building within the technological framework of the threat you expect. Every species we had ever encountered had done this, had studied our known capabilities and built countermeasures calibrated to those capabilities. Earth had not done this. What Earth had built was a system designed to defeat any fleet, from any species, operating on any set of principles. It was not calibrated to Keth shields or Keth armor or Keth weapons. It was calibrated to the fundamental physical vulnerabilities of any large, crude spacecraft, the need for power distribution, the need for propulsion, the structural requirements of anything built to contain a crew in vacuum. They had not studied us specifically. They had studied the problem of defending against an unknown advanced threat, and then built something that solved that problem without needing to know who the threat was going to be. I found this out later, in full detail, but I had begun to understand the outline of it at minute 47, and understanding it made me feel a very specific kind of tired. The tired of realizing that you had never been as smart as you thought you were. The third wave of their deployed units had by this point integrated itself throughout our fleet formation. This is the part I want to describe carefully, because it matters. These units, I still do not have a precise classification for them, and I will not pretend to, did not behave like missiles or drones or any other weapon category I could map to a known concept. They move through the formation without targeting individual ships directly. They moved to specific spatial positions between ships, around ships, relative to the fleet's geometry, and they stayed there. They held their positions with extraordinary precision, compensating for every movement of our ships, maintaining exact relative coordinates. I watched one of these units on my secondary monitor for several minutes. It was approximately 3 meters long, roughly cylindrical, moving with small adjustments to stay at a fixed point relative to the eternal decree's starboard side. It was not doing anything I could observe. It was just there, holding its position. Then it was somewhere else, 4,000 kilometers away, and the ship that had been closest to its previous position was gone from the formation map. I am aware that this description sounds imprecise. I am being as precise as I can. The transition from the unit holding its position to the unit being 4,000 kilometers away and a ship being gone was not a sequence I could resolve into separate events. It was a single moment with two outcomes. Our chief engineer, a meticulous and unflappable technician named Edvara, filed a report at this stage that I included verbatim in my documentation log. She wrote that whatever the third-wave units were doing, they were interacting with something at the quantum level of our ship's material composition. She wrote that she had no framework for how this was being accomplished. She wrote, in the precise, emotionless language of a technical report, that she believed the ships being removed from the formation map were not being destroyed, but were being displaced, moved somewhere else, or converted, or unmade, by a mechanism that did not have a name in our scientific vocabulary. She filed this report as a technical document. It was the most disturbing thing I read that day. I intercepted more human communications during this period. I had set up a passive collection system early in the engagement, capturing everything on every frequency, flagging anything with translation equivalents. Most of it was technical. Most of it was the language of engineers and system operators managing a complex deployment, update reports, position confirmations, status checks. The tone throughout was consistent, calm, focused, professional. There was one exchange that stood out. A woman's voice, I noted the different vocal characteristics in my log, spoke to someone I could not identify. She asked how the coverage was looking in the northern quadrant. The response was that northern quadrant was at 93% optimal. She said that was good enough. She said, and I wrote this down immediately, that they would do the full post-action analysis afterward, and that the engineering team had earned something called a weekend. Then she said, make sure the observer pod is prepped, we're keeping one. I did not understand that at the time. I filed it in my notes and moved on. The formation map showed 891 icons. I looked at that number for a long time. 891 out of 4,000. We had lost more than 3,000 ships, and the engagement was continuing and nothing had changed. We had fired everything we had. We had attempted to withdraw. We had attempted to communicate. The planet below us was still quiet and still blue and still going about its existence with that absolute, infuriating calm. Dorothy Kale called me over. I had never been called to the center of the bridge during an active engagement. My station was at the side, documentation only, observer status. I walked across the bridge with the awareness of every eye on it tracking my movement, and I stood next to Dorothy Kale, and I looked at the tactical display from his angle, which was slightly different from mine and somehow worse, because from his position, you could see the full three-dimensional projection of the fleet formation, and the way the green icons were distributed through it looked nothing like the tight, ordered structure we had arrived with. It looked like the last moments of a collapse that had already, structurally, been decided. He spoke quietly, so only I could hear. He said, You've documented every campaign in the Dominion's modern era." I said that was correct. He said, "Have you ever seen anything like this?" I said no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When this is over one way or another, what do you write?" I thought about it. I told him I would write what I saw. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back to the tactical display. The formation map showed 744 icons. Here is what I had concluded by that point about what Earth had built and how they had built it. I want to write this clearly because I believe it is the most important part of this account, more important than the tactical details, more important than the numbers. We had underestimated them based on a fundamental error in how we assess civilizations. We measured technological advancement by what a species deployed visibly: their ships, their satellites, their broadcast transmissions, the energy signatures of their active systems. We looked at what they showed and concluded from that what they were. Earth had shown very little. Earth had been quiet, technologically humble in every visible measure, for as long as our scouts had observed them. We had not asked why. The answer, which I assembled from those intercepted conversations and later confirmed in detail, was that Earth had made a deliberate decision approximately 300 years ago. A decision that their historians apparently debate endlessly, but that their military planners implemented with complete consistency. The decision was this: they would not invest in being the most powerful visible force in the galaxy. They would invest in being able to defeat the most powerful visible force in the galaxy, whoever that turned out to be, whenever they showed up. They had watched what happened to other civilizations that attracted attention by being visibly powerful. They had observed from a distance the pattern of how dominant civilizations expanded, and they had concluded that the right response to living in a galaxy with aggressive, expanding empires was not to build an empire of their own. It was to build something that empires could not survive. 300 years, every major engineering project hidden, every advanced development conducted underground, in the outer system, in installations that looked like nothing our scanners were trained to flag. 300 years of building a defense system in secret, knowing that someday something would come, not knowing exactly what, designing it to defeat the unknown. We were the unknown, and we had arrived exactly on schedule as far as they were concerned. I thought about the scouts' report, Orith Vaughn's report, the one Dorethkale had dismissed in 4 sentences. The anomalous thermal signatures, the unusual electromagnetic activity, the debris fields in the outer system. Every single one of those anomalies was a piece of what was currently removing 4,000 warships from the formation map one by one. We had read the signs. We had simply not believed what they were pointing at, because the conclusion they pointed at was too far outside our understanding of what a primitive species could accomplish. The formation map showed 501 icons. Dorethkale sent one more communication to Earth. He had given up the formal military language. He spoke simply, in a way I had never heard him speak before. He said that he acknowledged the situation. He said that he was asking, without conditions, for the engagement to stop. He waited. The human coordinator came back, the same voice still calm. The voice said, "The engagement will stop when it stops. That's not our decision anymore." I wrote that down and stared at it. That's not our decision anymore. What they had deployed was autonomous, self-directing. It had been given its parameters and it was executing them, and the humans on the ground were observing it the way you observe a process you've set in motion, with interest, with assessment, with the occasional technical note, but not with control. The decision to stop had been made before we arrived, built into the system, and it would execute on its own schedule. The formation map showed 289 icons. Sethral, the young navigator 2 stations to my left, was no longer at his console. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the station housing, his knees pulled up, looking at nothing. No one told him to get up. There was nothing for him to do at his console that the automated systems were not already doing, and the automated systems were not doing anything useful. I kept writing. The formation map showed 144 icons. Evara filed another technical report. She noted that the Eternal Decree's third wave unit had repositioned 3 times in the past 20 minutes. She noted that it had not yet executed whatever action the other units had executed against their proximate ships. She noted, with the careful language of a scientist documenting an observation she could not explain, that the unit appeared to be maintaining proximity to the flagship specifically, moving when we moved, staying close, but not acting. She concluded her report with a question she could not answer. Why were we still here? The formation map showed 17 icons. And then 3. And then 1. The Eternal Decree. I was going to write about the silence, but I want to start with something else. I want to start with what Doreth Kale did in the moments after the formation map showed only 1 icon. He stood at the center of the bridge. Around him, the bridge crew was still at their stations, not because there was anything for them to do, but because there was nowhere else to go. They were professionals. They had trained for emergencies, for damage control, for all the normal categories of difficulty that a military vessel might face. There was no training for this. But they stayed at their posts because that was what they knew how to do, and doing something familiar in an unfamiliar situation is a deeply human instinct. Or, I suppose, a deeply any species instinct. Doreth Kale looked at the formation map. He looked at the single icon. He looked at the tactical display, which showed the Eternal Decree alone in the space where 4,000 ships had been, with the Earth's deployed units still present in their positions around us, holding, not acting. Then he turned to me. "Keep writing," he said. I was already writing. The next several minutes, I have the exact timestamps in my documentation log, but I will spare the reader the precise numbers, were the quietest of the entire engagement. The sensors continued to report. The third wave unit Evara had been tracking held its position off the starboard side. Earth below us continued its orbit, unhurried. The FTL suppression field continued to hold. We were 3,999 ships fewer than when we had arrived, and we were still here, and we could not leave, and we did not know why we were still here when everything else was gone. The human coordinator contacted us. The voice was the same voice, the planetary defense coordinator. It said, "Flagship Eternal Decree, prepare to receive a boarding party." Doreth Kale looked at me. I looked at him. Around us, several of the bridge crew moved instinctively toward their duty stations, weapons, defense, access control. The coordinator said, "This is not an assault. We're sending one shuttle, 6 people. They're unarmed. Let them come aboard." Doreth Kale asked why. The voice said, "Because we want to talk, and because your translator units are losing nuance. There are things that need to be communicated precisely." Doreth Kale turned the question to his senior staff with a look. There were no good arguments against it. We had no weapons that had functioned effectively. We had no escape option. We were, in the straightforward military meaning of the word, held. A shuttle with 6 unarmed humans was not a new threat. It was a conversation offer. He authorized the docking. I moved to the secondary bridge monitoring station, where I could observe the docking bay cameras as well as the bridge. I did not want to miss anything. The shuttle that came aboard was small, functional, and unremarkable. It looked like a working vehicle, not a diplomatic one. No decoration, no ceremony, just a practical transport. It docked cleanly, which meant they were familiar with our docking protocols, which meant they had studied our technology in detail, which I added to my notes without surprise. 6 humans came through the docking tube. I had seen images of humans in the scout reports, but images had not prepared me for the specific experience of seeing them in person. They were smaller than I had expected, shorter than the average Keth, lighter in build, moving with a kind of unhurried ease that seemed wrong for the context. They were dressed practically, in plain working clothes. The one in front was a man perhaps 40 years old, with tired eyes and the posture of someone who had been awake for a very long time. Behind him came a woman about the same age, carrying a case, and 4 others who positioned themselves in a loose, relaxed arrangement that was not the formation of a guard detail, but also was not random. The man in front introduced himself as Owen Clark. He said he was the coordinator who had been speaking to us. He said it the way you introduce yourself at a professional meeting, matter-of-factly, without emphasis. He looked around the bridge. He looked at the crew at their stations. He looked at the formation map, which still showed one icon. He looked at Dorath Kale. He said, "I'm sorry about your fleet. That wasn't the outcome we wanted, but it was the outcome we built for." Dorath Kale said nothing for a moment. Then he asked why they had kept the flagship. Owen Clark said, "Because someone needs to go home and tell the story. And because what we're about to tell you is something the Dominion High Council needs to hear, and we didn't want it to go through a translator unit. We wanted it to go through you." He gestured to the woman with the case. She opened it and set up a display device on the flat surface of the nearest console. The display showed a map, a galactic map, with stars and systems marked and lines connecting certain systems to each other. The lines were not Keth territorial borders. They were something else. Owen Clark said, "We've been in contact with 14 other species over the past 70 years. All of them were contacted after your empire had passed through their systems." I wrote that down, 70 years. He said, "Some of them survived as civilizations. Some survived only as scattered populations. Some are rebuilding from almost nothing. We've been talking to all of them. We've been sharing information. And we've been working on something together." He pointed to the lines on the map. The lines connected Earth to 14 other systems, and the 14 other systems to each other. The woman with the case, whose name I did not yet know, said, "This is not an empire. We're not building what you built. It's a mutual defense agreement. 14 species and us. Everyone contributes what they can. Everyone shares what they know. And if anything, any fleet from any civilization moves against any member of this agreement, what you experience today happens to that fleet." I was writing very quickly. Dorath Kale asked the obvious question. He asked why they were telling us this. We were, by any reasonable assessment, the defeated party in this exchange. We had no leverage. They could have let us sit here until we ran out of supplies and then had that conversation with whoever they sent to collect the remains. Owen Clark was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have thought about every day since. He said, "Because we're not interested in destroying the Dominion. We're interested in what the Dominion does next. And we want you to have this information before you go home so that when the High Council makes its decision about what to do next, it makes that decision with full knowledge of what the situation actually is. No surprises. No information gaps. Full picture." He paused. "The Dominion can continue its expansion. That's a choice your council can make. If it does, this agreement will respond, and the response will be larger and more coordinated than what happened today, because today was only us. The next time it will be 15 species working together." He paused again. "Or the Dominion can stop, can engage with us, can participate in something different. That choice is also available. We're not interested in justice for what's already been done. That's not something we can provide, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. We're interested in what happens from today forward." The bridge was very quiet. The woman who had set up the display said, "We've had this conversation with 3 other civilizations in the past 40 years. 2 of them chose to stop. 1 of them didn't. We would prefer you choose to stop, but we want the choice to be real, and that means you have to actually go home and present it." She closed the case. The display folded away. Owen Clark looked at Dorothy Kale. He said, "We're going to drop the suppression field in about an hour. Your FTL drives will work. You can leave." He said it without drama. Then he looked at me. He had not looked at me before. I was a side figure away from the main exchange, writing in my documentation log. But he looked at me directly and said, "The scribe, you've been writing this whole time." I said yes. He said, "Good, make sure it's complete. Make sure you include the part where we gave you the choice. That part matters." I said I would include everything. He nodded. Then all 6 of them turned and walked back toward the docking bay the same way they had come, without hurry, without looking back, with the easy movement of people who had said what they came to say and were now going back to work. I kept writing. The FTL suppression field dropped 63 minutes later, exactly as Owen Clark had said it would. The drives charged cleanly. The jump executed on the first attempt. The blue planet disappeared, replaced by the clean, cold dark of faster-than-light transit. I sat at my documentation station for the entire 12-hour journey back to the staging point, and I wrote. I wrote continuously, stopping only twice, once for water, once when my hands cramped so badly that I had to flex them for several minutes before I could continue. I wrote everything. Every sensor reading, every formation map timestamp, every intercepted communication, every word spoken on the bridge. I wrote my own observations and my own analysis alongside the official record. I have never done that before. A war scribe's documentation is meant to be factual and separated from interpretation. I made an exception this time. I decided that interpretation was part of the record too. I wrote about the blue planet as I had first seen it. I wrote about the silence when we arrived. I wrote about the 200 green icons that went dark in 3 seconds and the voice that said, "That was your warning shot," and the engineers talking about budget overruns. I wrote about the formation map counting down and the moment it showed 1 and the way Dorothy Kale had said, "Keep writing," when there was nothing else to do and no one else to give orders to. I wrote about Owen Clark and the woman with the case, and the 14 lines on the map connecting Earth to 14 other systems. I wrote about what I had done for 40 years. I wrote about the worlds I had documented falling silent. I wrote about the records I had kept, precise, complete, professional records of civilizations being erased. I had been proud of my precision. I had understood it as a form of respect, in a strange way, the careful documentation of something significant. I looked at that belief for a long time on the transit home, and I found that it did not survive careful examination. Dorothy Kale came to my station once during the transit. He stood there without speaking for a moment, looking at the lines of text accumulating on my screen. Then he asked if I was going to include everything. I said yes. He said, "Including the part where I dismissed Orith Vaughn's report." I said yes. He was quiet, then he said, "Good." He went back to his seat. We arrived at the staging point to find 2 scout vessels waiting. They had been at long-range observation distance during the campaign and had received only partial sensor data, enough to know that the fleet had not returned on schedule, but not enough to understand what had happened. When the eternal decree came out of FTL alone, I watched the scout crews process this information in real time through the communication feeds, and the processing took longer than it should have, because the information was outside the range of what they had prepared themselves to receive. We proceeded to the capital. I will not document the transit in detail. It was long and quiet, and I spent most of it reviewing my documentation log, checking for gaps, adding detail where I had written too quickly in the moment. By the time we reached the capital system, word had traveled ahead of us through the automated beacon network. The beacons could carry only basic data, but 7th Annihilation Fleet failed to return was basic enough. The capital was already processing the information in its own way when we arrived. I could see it in the transmission patterns, in the changed frequencies of official communications, in the unusual amount of secure channel activity from government centers. Doreth Kale was summoned to the High Council within 2 hours of our arrival. I was summoned with him, which had never happened before in my career. A war scribe attended campaigns. A war scribe did not attend High Council briefings. I understood why the exception was being made. The High Council chamber was a large, formal space I had only seen in images. 12 council members seated in a curved arrangement, with the council speaker at the center. They were all present, which I was told was unusual. Full attendance was typically reserved for formal declarations of major campaigns or significant political events. The loss of 4,000 ships apparently qualified. Doreth Kale gave his account. He was precise and complete. He did not minimize anything, did not offer alternative explanations for what happened, did not suggest that different tactics might have produced different results. He told them what he had seen. He told them what Earth had done. He told them about Owen Clark and the case and the 14 lines on the map. When he finished, the chamber was quiet. The council speaker asked how this was possible, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. How was it possible that a species at Earth's apparent technological level had developed systems that had removed 4,000 warships from existence? I answered, because Doreth Kale indicated that I should. I explained what I had understood from the intercepted communications and the conversation with Owen Clark, the 300 years of hidden development, the philosophy of building to defeat the unknown rather than the known, the decision to remain visibly primitive while quietly developing something else entirely. I said, they were not hiding their weakness, they were hiding their strength. And the reason they could hide it successfully was because we looked at them and saw what we expected to see and stopped looking after that. The chamber was quiet again. One of the council members, a senior figure named Kale Duth, who had served on the council for longer than I had been alive, asked about the choice. Owen Clark's offer, the 14-species agreement, and the option the Dominion had been given. I explained it fully. Kale Duth said, they believe we will choose to stop. I said I did not know what they believed. I said that Owen Clark had told me the choice needed to be real, which implied they thought the Dominion might not stop. I said that what I believed, based on what I had seen, was that the humans had prepared for both outcomes and were genuinely indifferent to which one occurred. In the tactical sense, their system would function either way. Another council member asked about the 14 species, whether they were a credible military force. I said, the question may not be about military force. The question may be about what kind of civilization we intend to be. That statement produced the longest silence of the session. I had never said anything like that to the High Council before. I had never said anything like that to anyone before, including myself. I am a war scribe. I document facts. Philosophical observations are outside my professional category, but I said it, and once it was in the air, I did not regret it. Doreth Kale looked at me briefly. The council speaker looked at me. Kale Duth looked at me. No one responded to it directly. The session moved to technical questions, the FTL suppression technology, the weapon system classifications, the timeline for developing any potential countermeasures. I answered what I could and acknowledged the limits of my knowledge clearly. After the session, walking through the capital city for the first time in months, I passed a memorial wall near the government district, a long surface covered with the names of Keth soldiers who had died in campaigns over the centuries. There were many names. There had been many campaigns. I had documented most of the modern ones. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. I thought about Owen Clark looking at me on the bridge and saying, "Make sure it's complete." I thought about the woman who had set up the display, whose name I still did not know at that point, describing 14 species connected by lines on a map. I thought about the historian on Earth who had shown me, this came later during my months on Earth, which I will describe shortly, records of worlds the Dominion had erased. The way she had looked at those records, not with anger, with sadness. I thought about the scout Orth Vaughn, whose report about anomalous readings had been dismissed in 4 sentences, and who had been right about every single anomaly. I thought about what the Dominion's memorial wall would look like to someone from one of the 14 species. I submitted my documentation log to the official archive that evening. All of it, every sensor reading, every timestamp, every intercepted human communication, every word from Owen Clark, every interpretation I had added alongside the facts. Thousands of pages of the most complete record of a military defeat in the history of Keth documentation. The archive clerk who received it looked at the file size and then looked at me. I told him to make sure it was backed up in multiple locations. He asked if there was a classification level. I said, none, leave it open. Every Keth citizen should be able to read this. He looked uncertain about that, but he logged it as I directed. 3 days later, I received a message from Owen Clark. I do not know how he sent it. I do not know how he had my contact information, or how the message passed through the communication barriers between Earth and the Dominion capital without being intercepted or delayed. It arrived in my personal message log, clean and complete, as if it had always been there. It said, "We heard you submitted the full record. Good. There's an open invitation here if you want to see the rest of what we've built. The offer doesn't expire." I sat with that message for a long time. Then I wrote back and said I would come. The journey to Earth took me 6 weeks on a small civilian transport, the fastest schedule I could arrange. I will not detail the journey, because it is not the important part. The important part is what I found when I arrived, not the weapon systems or the defense installations or the enormous industrial complexity hidden beneath the surface of a world that looked from orbit like nothing more than an unusually beautiful blue planet. Those things were impressive, and I documented them carefully. The important part was a room in a building near the coast, where a woman named Alice Marsh sat across a table from me and spent 4 hours showing me records of worlds the Keth Dominion had claimed. Alice Marsh was a historian. She was 60 years old with a steady voice and a clear way of organizing information. She was not a soldier, had never been a soldier, and had the precise, patient manner of someone whose entire life had been spent understanding things rather than changing them. She showed me the records without commentary. She let me read. When I had questions, she answered them. She showed me records of species who had sent messages to Earth after our campaigns passed through their systems. In several cases, before the campaigns were finished, frantic transmissions on emergency frequencies that had reached Earth weeks or months later. She showed me what Earth had done with those messages, stored them, studied them, added them to the picture they were assembling. She showed me the linguistic database Earth had built from the communications of 14 species, the cultural archives, the histories. She showed me which ones were intact and which ones had to be reconstructed from fragments. She said, we couldn't stop what happened to them. By the time we knew it was happening, it was already over. What we could do was remember. I said, we did not leave records. She said, no, but they did before you arrived. People always leave records. I asked her why she was showing me this. She said, because you asked to see the rest of what we built. This is part of it. The weapons are the part that stopped your fleet. This is the part that explains why we built the weapons. I sat with that for a moment. I asked her if she was angry. She looked at me carefully. She said, I've been working with these records for 20 years. I think I moved through anger a long time ago. What I have now is, I don't have a word for it. It's the feeling you get when you look at a problem for long enough that you understand it completely. And understanding it completely doesn't make it better. It just means you see it clearly. I understood that feeling. I had it too, though I had only recently acquired it. I spent 3 months on Earth. I met Owen Clark twice more, briefly, professionally, 2 men comparing notes on a historical event they had both been present for from very different positions. I met engineers and historians and military planners, and 3 members of the Defense Council that had overseen the system that had neutralized the 7th Annihilation Fleet. I asked questions and I listened to answers, and I wrote everything down. I learned that the woman who had set up the display on the Eternal Decrees Bridge was named Laura Finch, and that she was the head of the Interspecies Relations Division, and that she had spent 15 years preparing for the conversation she had had with Dorath Kale and me in about 12 minutes. I met her for a longer conversation in my 2nd month. She was precise and thoughtful, and had a habit of pausing before she answered questions, not because she was uncertain, but because she was making sure she said exactly what she meant. I asked her, in that conversation, what she had thought when she was standing on the bridge of the Eternal Decree, surrounded by what remained of the High Executor's crew, in the aftermath of the worst military defeat in Keth history. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "I thought about how young you all looked, the crew, even the commander. I knew you were a species with a much longer lifespan than ours, so the ages didn't match up to what I was expecting. But there was something about the expressions, the way people look when something has happened that their entire framework doesn't have a category for." She paused. I thought they really thought this would be simple, and they weren't wrong to think that based on everything they knew. The information they had pointed to simple. We just made sure the information they had was incomplete. I asked if she thought the Dominion would take the offer. She said, "I think some of them will want to. I think some of them will argue for another fleet or 5 fleets and will need to be persuaded by the people who understand the situation. I think it will take time. These things usually do." She said, "Owen thinks you'll be useful in that argument. He thinks you writing everything down, exactly as it happened, will matter more than any diplomatic communication we could send." I asked what she thought. She said, "I think he's right. I also think you already know that, and that's why you haven't stopped writing since you got here." She was correct. I am writing this final portion of my account in a small room near the coast of a continent called Europe, with a window that looks out over a gray stretch of water that the humans call the Atlantic. It is not a dramatic view, but it is a very steady one. The water moves, the light changes, and the horizon holds its position without effort. I have been thinking about the formation map, about the way the green icons went dark, one by one, and then in groups, and then near the end in the long, terrible sequence of small losses that added up to a single impossible number. I have been thinking about what those icons represented, not ships, but the crews inside them. I have been thinking about Sethral sitting on the floor with his knees pulled up, looking at nothing, and about Edvara filing a calm technical report about mechanisms she could not name, and about Dorhathkale standing at the center of a bridge that had become the last operational Keth command post in an engagement against a world that had never, from the moment we arrived, shown the slightest sign of fear. I have been thinking about what I am going home to say. When I return to the Dominion, and I will return soon, because that is where the argument needs to be made, and I am apparently one of the people who needs to make it, I will present my full documentation log to the High Council and to the Public Archive, both of which I understand are currently in the process of studying the first submission I made before I left. I will add this final account. I will make it available to everyone. And I will say, to anyone who will listen, what I have come to understand in the months since a blue planet destroyed 4,000 warships without crewing a single vessel in response. The Dominion has survived for 800 years because no one we encountered was prepared for us. Earth survived because they had been prepared for us, or something like us, for 3 centuries. The difference between those 2 positions is not weapons or ships or technology. The difference is time and intention, and the willingness to look at the universe clearly and plan for what it actually is rather than what is comfortable to believe. We believed the universe was ours because we had never lost. Earth believed the universe was unpredictable and dangerous and full of things that could arrive without warning, and they built accordingly. One of those beliefs was accurate. I am 61 years old. I have documented victories my entire professional life. I am aware of the irony in the fact that the most important document I will ever produce is an account of an absolute defeat. I have decided that the irony is acceptable and possibly appropriate. In 3 days, I will leave Earth on a civilian transport heading toward the Dominion capital. In my bag is a data storage unit containing every word of this account, every sensor log, every intercepted communication, every timestamp from the 47 minutes, the formation map spent counting down from 4,000 to 1. On the side of the ship that brought me here, in letters visible from the docking bay, in Keth script, there is a sentence the humans put there when they delivered it to me. It says, "This was us being kind." I have looked at that sentence every day since I arrived. I understand what it means. It means that what happened to 4,000 ships was the minimum response, the calibrated, deliberate, precisely restrained response of a civilization that could have done more and chose not to. It means that whatever the Dominion does next, it does next with complete knowledge of what the other option looks like. It means that the choice is real, and the choice has to be made, and I am going home to make sure the people making it understand exactly what they are choosing between. My name is Verath Sul. I am the last surviving officer of the 7th Annihilation Fleet of the Keth Dominion. I am going home. And for the first time in 61 years, I am not entirely sure what I am going home to record. But I think, for the first time, I am hopping for something other than a victory.